Welcome to the She, He, We Awakening podcast. We are a wife and husband therapy team whose professional and personal lives are centered on psychology and spirituality.
We love sharing what we've learned on our journey of becoming conscious through relationship, and we invite you to get to know us and hopefully hear in our stories something that can support you in your life too.
Hello, my love. We meet again.
Hello.
Welcome back, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So today we are going to talk about archetypal inflation. And as a brief review, you had suggested to me just moments ago that we briefly review spiritualized ego and just, of course, ego as well. So very brief review. If you haven't, please go back and watch or listen to the podcast on spiritualized ego. But as brief review, we talk about the ego as being the structure and or activity of consciousness that provides a framework for perspective of a seemingly separate self, a person, a small self. And it is that activity of consciousness that allows us to have relationship and to interact as two seemingly separate beings. So consistent with that, we talked about how ego death is not really a thing, nor would you want to pursue it. And that in fact, the process of waking up is not a destruction of the ego. It is maybe best characterized as a softening or a dissolution, a dissolving of the ego, and a movement of the sense of I beyond the sphere of ego into something greater, but that ego container remains intact at the same time. And then spiritualized ego is when we get really invested in the light qualities of ego, the things that we imagine as spiritual, all of the positive, shiny, pretty attributes that we associate with being spiritual. We sort of attach to those, we take them on, we identify with them. And instead of those qualities softening the ego and allowing us to expand beyond it, they serve to only concretize the ego into its particle form. And our sense of self, or our sense of identity, then actually becomes more rigid and more locked into ego as opposed to being freed from ego. So that's spiritualized ego.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is another phenomenon that takes place psychologically and or spiritually, depending on how you think of it. And that is what we're talking about today, which is archetypal inflation. And archetypal inflation has some relationship to spiritualized ego. They can look very similar. You've described it, and I'll let you get into that later about, there's it's a sort of a Venn diagram where there's a space of overlap there between spiritualized ego and archetypal inflation. But simply put, archetypal inflation is when we identify not just with certain specific spiritual qualities, but with an entire archetype. And we begin to identify with that archetype, and we begin to actually hand over our autonomy and even our personal will to the archetypal force that is captured in the symbol of the particular archetype. So a really easy one would be something like hero, where it's not just that we begin to see the value of heroic qualities and allow certain heroic qualities to become things that we pursue that could serve to sort of solidify our ego, but instead it's when we actually think we are a hero, or even the hero of the story in the world, perhaps. And then everything about that hero archetype begins to sort of move into our psychology and consume us. And to me, that's one of, if not the most important distinguishing features of archetypal inflation, is that we are consumed by the archetype. It literally takes us over and begins to run the show.
Mm.
And so in that sense, it is a deeply, deeply unconscious phenomenon.
Okay. So one of the ways that we know we are in archetypal inflation versus spiritualized ego versus just ego is when there is a sense of grandiosity.
Yes,
Is that how you
grandiosity.
say grandiosity?
Tomato, tomato.
Tomato, tomato.
Yes.
So a spiritualized ego is not necessarily grandiose. There are people who are in the spiritualized ego who are very quiet and very simple, living very simple lives. They have, they still think they are the light ego. They are rejecting the dark, but they aren't quite as, I want to say, flamboyant or in your face with the character that they're playing, the role. So with archetypal inflation, there are it is much more obvious. For instance, people in archetypal inflation may even wear a costume, have a certain costume that they are in, literally like cloth that they're wearing around. So, for example, I know people when I've met people who really strongly identify with the archetype of the witch. And they have whole sets of costumes and clothing that they wear daily. This isn't just like going to a festival and I'm putting on a fun costume. This is clothes that they wear daily as part of the assumption of this archetype. And they don't see themselves, they aren't really seeing the fact that they're kind of playing this cliche character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's that word cliche, I think, is important when it comes to archetypal inflation, because the one that is possessed by the archetype and in this archetypal inflation, they're often possessed by this sense of specialness, and that's related to the grandiosity that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
There's this sense of uniqueness and specialness and self-importance that actually from the outside does actually look cliche, because there actually is nothing sort of personally unique or flavorful about it. It is really just the archetype showing up as the archetype always shows up. So the hero archetype always has the same trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look at movies and literature and see that there's different nuances that certain authors or artists have, but the story arc, the basic story arc, is always the same, because the archetype is always the same. And so somebody possessed by the archetype has this sense of being really special and unique, but in fact, it's very, very cliche.
Some sense of living their own life. But if you look at the life, it kind of seems to follow a script.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
It's another good way of putting it is that from the perspective of the one who is possessed by the archetype, the perception is, I'm choosing to live my life in this special way. The reality is there really is no I. There is only the archetype living its reality through the person. And again, the personal will of the individual is progressively lost.
Immediately what came to mind is certain people that we've worked with have come to us in mental health like a serious mental health crisis, in an emergency
Mhm.
of some kind, where they have perhaps been meditating, or they have gone on an ayahuasca journey, or they have done a really intense yoga practice, and they are their relatives. I mean, a few times we've had relatives ask us to please help their family member because they are not they're not in their right mind, so to speak. They
Yes.
have lost themselves in some kind of inflated place.
Mhm.
So I think it's relatively common, from what I've read and researched, that some people will have a break, some kind of a break in their consciousness,
Mhm.
or a perceived break, in which they will have this Messiah, an archetypal inflation of being the Messiah, where they don't just think they have some godlike qualities. They believe themselves to be God or Jesus or the Messiah come
Savior,
again,
some kind of savior.
Savior,
Yes.
some kind of strong archetypal inflation,
Yeah.
where they have no sense of the Jim or whoever they were before.
Yeah.
They will say, in the extreme cases, that Jim is dead.
Yes. Yes. I'm going to make a Ghostbusters reference now.
Oh, please.
There is no Dana. There is only Zool.
Yeah.
That's archetypal inflation. The
Yes.
personality has completely given way, and it is just this larger force that has moved in and has taken over the personality.
Right.
That is absolutely archetypal inflation. So, um, yes, that lends it that sort of manic, fractured mental health quality to it.
Mhm.
That's one of the key distinguishing features between the archetypal inflation scenario and spiritualized ego. Spiritualized ego is very well contained. In
Mhm.
fact, the whole point is that it's too well contained.
Right.
The ego is too rigid, and now the sense of identity is so tightly compacted into this rigid structure that it can't really soften into a true revelation of self, a true
Mm.
awakening. But in that case, there's no risk of that ego fracturing at all. That person will present as very, very healthy mentally. And in fact, they are. We
Right.
talked about this in that podcast, that people in spiritualized ego can live their entire life and be just extraordinarily wonderful, pleasant, productive, grounded human beings. They're just not self-realized. And
And
there's
they're not in touch with the dark
right.
aspect of themselves.
Yes.
Yeah. Whereas the archetypal inflation will show light and dark.
Yes. Yeah, that the possession of the archetype is not exclusively light.
Mhm.
Yes. Even if it's the hero archetype showing up, which we think of as being a positive light attribute kind of archetype, the shadow of the hero archetype will come through and express as well, in some kind of self-destruction, or to make another pop culture reference, um, had Luke Skywalker actually succumbed to the temptation of the Emperor and embraced the dark side, so to speak,
Mm.
right? That would have been those archetypal forces moving through him.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Yes. So I want to say one more thing about
yeah, great.
when archetypal inflation becomes um, a psychiatric emergency.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. That people who are really gone in this they need serious professional help. Neither you nor I have ever worked with someone in that place alone. They
Right.
have always needed sometimes inpatient admission,
Mm.
but the difficulty is what comes up, what goes up must come down.
Right.
So when people are flying high in this inflation, inevitably there's going to be a crash into the darkness. And I think most people who are interested in psychedelics, for instance, have read about somebody coming off a bad trip and killing themselves because they could not reconsolidate themselves.
Yes.
Or they were depressed by the reconsolidation process.
Right.
Like, oh, I guess I'm not, a magician or whatever
Right.
the inflation was around.
Right. Yeah, there can certainly be an addictive quality to it because it is a tapping into a significant power and energy. But it's an impersonal power and energy that the ego is not prepared to actually contain. And so the ego can absolutely fracture.
Yep. And there's a wonderful book called Spiritual Emergency by Stanislav Grof that talks about this phenomenon of archetypal inflation and also the whole diagnosis of schizophrenia as a spiritual phenomenon that's not well understood by Western medicine.
Right.
And so this psychiatrist who wrote this book pioneered a series of treatment facilities where people could go be treated for their schizophrenia, kept safe, brought back down to earth safely, consolidated into their ego, and given a spiritual framework for them to understand what had occurred.
Yeah. Cool. I didn't know about that.
Oh yeah, it's a great book.
Nice. Yeah, I just feel compelled to sort of emphasize here that in helping people understand, feeling into and asking themselves the question, okay, where am I tiptoeing towards spiritualized ego? Where am I tiptoeing towards archetypal inflation? That really, this key distinguishing feature is really, I think you could sum it up in how well grounded one feels, or trusting others to report back to them, hey, you don't seem particularly well grounded. If we're tiptoeing towards spiritualized ego, it's going to be a sense of superiority and separate and specialness that has a really grounded quality to it. But archetypal inflation is going to have this sense of specialness and uniqueness that is not grounded at all. It has a manic sort of quality to it. And so to me, that's one of the ways to distinguish between spiritualized ego and archetypal inflation.
That's a really great way, actually, because when I think back over certain clients that I've had and friends that I've had that have been moving through this energy of inflation, I have, it's like kind of like a person who's like a balloon on a string.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the work that I would do with people would be body work. Like, let me help you reorient into form here.
Yeah, somatic work.
Yes, more somatic work rather than, this would not be the time to do a lot of breath work, a lot of pranayama work.
Right.
It's a dangerous thing to do potentially for your mental health.
Yeah. But it's not always, archetypal inflation doesn't always present in such a crisis.
That's not always dramatic like this.
Or dramatic or emergent. Sure. So there's more subtle ways, right? And so maybe we should kind of help people connect to that. What are some ways in which we can subtly begin moving into archetypal inflation? You already mentioned the magician. I think that's a good example. Others that I would closely associate would be things like teacher / guru, healer,
savior, Messiah.
Yes. Generally, all of these would be sort of caregiver type archetypes. And
Can be,
where we want to pay attention to again, just languaging. We've talked about this a lot. What do you say you are? And some people will say, I am a healer. or I am, I've seen it say, a magician. And when we begin to use language like that, it's a sign that we're tiptoeing into archetypal inflation a bit, and potentially beginning to surrender our personal autonomy to these unconscious forces.
Right. I think one of the ways that I tend to see it is that it occurs over time, where you see someone kind of, or you can feel yourself getting more drawn into something in a habitual, unconscious kind of way. So one of the distinguishing features again of this archetypal inflation is that it tends to become less conscious as you go, whereas the spiritualized ego, the intent is to become more conscious. So there's a little bit of an opposite, factor here with that.
Yeah.
So people get a little bit more lost in the character and in the world of whoever they think they are.
Right.
Yes. So one example that we talked about a little bit with the spiritualized ego, and I want to just mention it again, is Ram Dass, this spiritual teacher who went to India, met a guru. The guru gave him a new name. His name was Richard Alpert. Now he became Ram Dass. And he went into a yoga ashram and was there for 6 months. And as is appropriate when you are in a foreign country, began to assimilate into the culture and take on and appreciate the aspects of the culture. And when he came home, he was also a yogi. So he got off the plane. He talks about this in lots of his speeches and his books, and was picked up, and he had a long beard and was wearing a white, like, loincloth type thing. And his father, this very prim and proper, respectable Bostonian man, picked him up and thought he was a homeless man because he looked so out of the character for who he had been before, which was a Harvard professor. So anyways, he comes home and he's in this outfit, and he continued to wear this outfit for a while. And he says he got very lost in the character. He really, he was having these incredible moments of lucidity when he was teaching, but he was also very lost and really got out of touch with who Richard Alpert was. And as he developed and grew, he could see how out of touch he was with Richard Alpert, how much he wanted to take his old personality and reject it, and along with the whole family and everything that was part of his old life. But then he went back to wearing his, he wasn't quite back to his Harvard professor gear, but he was wearing pants and shirts, and he kind of re-entered into his old persona a little bit more.
Yeah, or just some sense of, again, the ego provides us with a structure for operating in an interactive social sort of way. Archetypal inflation does not provide that, right? Archetypal inflation is, the guy that looks like the homeless person who insists that he's the Messiah, wearing the sandwich board on the street corner. There's no appreciation for fitting in a healthy, egoic way. And of course, regardless of how much accurate truth that homeless man on the corner in the with the sandwich board sign might have access to, nobody's listening, right? Because from the perspective of those with functioning egos, they look and see that and think that guy's crazy. And so whatever message there might be, it's actually lost because it's not coming through channels that are palatable and able to be processed by people with functioning egos. Even though you can sort of listen to somebody like that and go, oh, actually what he just said was actually true. That's actually there's some profound spiritual truth and wisdom coming from that person, but nobody's paying attention.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So if you find yourself going back to, am I in archetypal inflation? If you find yourself in one character role where you say, this is who I am,
Hmm.
and I'm going to just be me everywhere I go with no flexibility,
Hmm.
then that's a potential sign. It's not necessarily, but
Yeah.
that's a potential sign that
Yeah.
you're inflated.
Yeah. I'm just going to do my own thing, regardless of how well it's received or whether it's received or what it means for my life.
Mhm.
Whether, I've lost my job, my career, my home, my family, like these are things that are important. And if all of that is suddenly just being stripped away, because of this character that is being played through us, and again, to me, that's important language. We're not playing a character. The character has consumed us. It has taken on a life of its own, and it's possession. It's archetypal possession.
Mm. Yeah, and you also talked at length about this in the Puer Senex talk,
Yeah.
where you talked about how the Puer complex as an archetype, when you're caught in that, when you're possessed by the Puer, it
Hmm.
will, it is not you living your life.
That's right. It often lives through us, in the form of addictions. It could be
Mm,
alcohol and drugs. It can be gambling. It can be an addiction to adrenaline, extreme sports. It can be sex addiction.
mhm.
Um, all of these things, we call them addictions sometimes, and we treat them like biological or chemical or even psychological problems, which of course they will show up that way.
Mhm.
But often it's this puer archetype, the free-spirited boy who does not want to be confined to the realm of the human being, and the senex side of that, um, and just consumes the personality. And I think addiction's a great example because people can understand that the loss of self-control, of I-ness, of personal will, and personal agency in the face of these addictions, it just seems to evaporate. Um, and in the extreme cases, people then identify with that loss of personality, and they think, no, that is me. I'm actually choosing to do this. Um, an example from something, I can't remember if we mentioned it before, but from something that we've watched and is in pop culture these days, is that documentary on the Canadian kid who,
The alpinist.
yeah, the alpinist.
Mhm.
And we watched that movie and just watched the psychology, paid attention to the cues, the language, the things he was saying, looked at some of the relationships and went, okay, the relationship with the mom has this strange quality and there's no mention of dad, both of which are red flags and consistent with the puer. And about halfway through, I said, there's no way this doesn't end with this guy dying. And spoiler alert, he
Yeah,
dies, right?
yeah.
And it's not just because, oh, well, he's doing risky things. And so I'm, placing a bet that the risky thing, it's no, because that's the only way the story can end. That's the story of that archetype. And so this young man thought, no, I'm just choosing to do these things because this is how I'm wired and this is the way I choose to live my life, etc. But you can see the Puer archetype right there on the surface had totally consumed him and was compelling him up these mountains on with picks, climbing
Yeah.
waterfalls with
Mhm.
no safety gear, and like the Puer always does when it doesn't give way to a more integrated Senex quality, the Puer dies. Icarus flies too high, the wings melt, and he crashes into the ocean.
Right. Yep. Yes. So for anybody watching this, if you want to see a very a beautiful example of someone caught in an archetype, possessed by an archetype, watch that movie. It's a really good one. And you can see there's an unconsciousness around this person. This person is not in spiritualized ego, climbing the mountain, in touch with his mortality, in touch with why he's climbing, the deep implications of the risks that he's taking in his life and how it will impact his community and other people he is in relationship to. Those are all things that a healthy functioning ego considers. But someone with acting through this archetypal energy is simply being a puer, just being the child, being that one who wants to fly high, to climb. That's the nature of the puer, to climb.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Puer is a good example that shows up. Any other examples? We talked about Messiah, witch.
Yeah, goddess is something that I see in the communities I'm parts of. Athlete. I think that's I don't know if you can make that same as hero, but it's kind of like hero.
Yeah, I think it has some associations with hero and also with warrior. Athletes are sort of the modern day gladiators. They enter the arena and compete for the adulation of the crowd. And we see what happens when people become possessed by that archetype. Like all of the warriors of ancient story, it's a catastrophic end in some way, typically.
Right.
Sometimes when they're dragged out of the arena against their will, they're forced to give up the game, and then you see their lives very quickly spiral out of control, because to go out into the quote real world after a professional sports career requires a functioning ego, requires the ability to make decisions and assess risk and things like that. And they'll blow all their money, or drive drunk and kill somebody.
Yeah, it requires a sense of self that is larger than athlete.
Yes.
Right. Or like you said, a sense of self at all, or at least some sense of self that includes something else besides athlete.
Right.
Or warrior. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned the mob mentality.
Oh, yes. Yes. So that's an example of, it's not necessarily a particular archetype, but I think it will help people understand what archetypal inflation looks like. In the mob, what you have is the surrender of individual personal will to this larger force. And so there is no longer a bunch of individual personalities. There is just the personality of the mob. The individual autonomy has been surrendered, and everyone just sort of succumbs to this massive influx of energy that's moving through and consuming and possessing the mob as a whole. And so when that happens, that mob, it's no longer a collection of individuals making individual decisions. It is literally, it's a force of nature. It's a force that has come up from the unconscious and has found personalities that have been able to be possessed by that force of nature, and has taken them over, and then is just doing its thing, whatever that might be.
Yes, and this also makes me think of both cults and gangs, where there's a set of thoughts that have been ingrained into the sort of superimposed on the egos of the individuals. There's kind of a uniform that's typical in cults and in gangs. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Anything else that?
Yeah. So I think I wanted to talk just a little bit about, where I have walked in. I don't know that I was not archetypally inflated, but there are a couple areas or a couple archetypes in which I could have lost myself. One of them was the mother archetype. And, that was a very strong acting archetype in me. And I very strongly identified as the mother. And there were times in which the dark side of mother came out in me and came out in relationships. over mothering, smothering,
Mhm.
wanting to be devouring. Another one was healer. The dark and the light side of that definitely has shown up in my relationships with people. The dark side of healer for me is things like clinging to clients, being afraid of clients leaving, feeling protective of clients, not wanting them to go to other practitioners,
Mhm.
that defensive around my role as a healer, things
Yeah.
like that.
Or even just when any attempt to force healing onto someone is forcing our ideas about what healing looks like onto the person who may or may not be interested in that.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest thing for me.
Right.
I know
Yeah.
what your healing looks like.
Yeah. I think that one's super, super pervasive in the communities that we've been a part of over the years. And I think that's the area where I also tiptoed around this. I had this sense of, oh no, I'm this, really well-trained healer, and look how many people I touch and they feel better. And so all of a sudden then everybody who comes in, nope, I know exactly what the problem is here, and I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to fix it. And nope, I don't really care what you have to say. I'm not really interested in you as a person. You're just sort of the next object for me to glue back together.
Yeah.
That's shadow healer. Yeah.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
But the reason why we weren't lost in inflation is neither one of us was unconscious in that. We had the tendency to go a little unconscious, but we were
Yeah.
not completely unconscious. We were aware, thank goodness, for each other and
Yep.
for other people in our circle who were helping us to pay attention to these dynamics and come out of the attitude that we are the source of healing.
Right. Yes. Yep. Well, as far as takeaways from this, and ways to sort of pay attention and then be with what you're finding, I'm going to come back to the same thing I said about spiritualized ego, which is pay attention to your sense of specialness and to the sense of grandiosity that is present within you. And just paying attention and making sure you check in with that ensures the only way you can perform a check-in is by being grounded in ego. Right. And so if you're performing a check-in with yourself and going, okay, how inflated am I getting here? How important and grandiose do I feel? It's the ego that's the one checking in. So
sort of like a dumbbell curl for the ego.
yeah, it's a great. I'm all about weightlifting analogies anytime that works. Good work. Yes.
Yes. I agree. That is important. I would also say that with archetypal inflation, it's a little tricky because of the tendency to become so unconscious.
Yep.
So if you have people in your life who are saying, you don't seem very grounded, or you're going to healers or people that you trust, and they're telling you you're not very grounded, something is off, pay attention.
Yeah.
Especially if you hear it more than once. If you hear it once, then, sit with it.
Take it with a grain of salt, sure.
Right. And then also pay attention to your surroundings, become conscious of what you are doing habitually, collecting habitually, thinking about habitually.
Language, habitual language.
Yep, habitual
How
language.
strongly do you identify with the qualities of a particular archetype?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with identifying with archetypes in and of itself. It's just when it becomes exclusive. You don't want to exclusively identify with any one of these archetypes. Who we are is much, much bigger than even the archetypes.
That's right.
The wholeness of who we are contains all archetypes and all egos.
Right. Yes.
So
that's a great way of putting it. Yeah. Yes. Because if your sense of self requires you to reject other archetypal forms, that's a clue.
Yeah.
Yep. Great.
That was a good summary.
Great. All right, everybody. We will see you next time.